1988's Lamp for Time is an absolute masterpiece. It's probably my favorite movie, and it has been just about my entire life. It gets a lot right, and much of it, maybe even most of it, still holds up remarkably well. At least I think so. However, as much as I love The Lamp for Time, I don't want this video to just be an empty love letter to the property. I would like to be a bit more critical than that. I want to analyze this piece of media, talk about what I think its limitations are by discussing its shortcomings, and yes, praise it where necessary. This video is going to be a bit of a longer one, so kick your feet up, grab a snack, while I talk about The Land Before Time. Don Bluth was an animation director back at Disney from 1955 to 1979. That was until he organized a walkout in September of that same year. He left alongside animators John Pomeroy, Gary Goldman, and 8 other members of the animation staff. The group of them actually parted from Disney during the production of Fox and the Hound. Apparently, from what I read, they weren't all that fond of the corporate nature that was being imposed on them from Disney's animation sector. Bluth then started his own company, Don Bluth Productions. They're responsible for the film The Secret of Nim in 1982, a movie that I myself remember fondly, but apparently wasn't particularly well received, grossing under $15 million at the domestic box office at the time. In the years following the underwhelming release of The Secret of Nim, Disney themselves seemed to be struggling. The Black Cauldron was innovative and perhaps ahead of its time, being the company's first animated film to incorporate the use of CGI. Unfortunately, with a budget of nearly $44 million, the movie ultimately grossed less than half that domestically with $21 million. By all accounts, it was seen as a failure. And in a better world, Don Bluth Productions might have been able to use that failure to challenge his former company, go toe to toe with the mighty House of Mouse, the very company that drove him away. However, the animation strike of 1982 proved to be disastrous for Bluth, as he was forced to file bankruptcy and then disband Don Bluth Productions. This setback didn't last too long, though, as Bluth, being backed by a wealthy businessman by the name of Morris Sullivan, was able to start a new company, Sullivan Bluth Studios. In coordination with Steven Spielberg, the movie American Tail from 1986 was born. It was a massive success, becoming the highest grossing non Disney animated film at the time, making $84 million on a budget of just $9 million. Adding to its success was the fact that it greatly overshadowed Disney's own rodent animated movie, The Great Mouse Detective, which, funny enough, released early that year and only brought in $50 million on a budget of $14 million. The stage was set, and in just 2 years, Bluth would compete again against the mighty House of Mouse. The Lamp for Time versus Oliver and Company. This time, the movies didn't just release in the same calendar year, but on the exact same day, November 18th, 1988. The world that The Lamp for Time brings us feels lived in. As of, for instance, during my rewatch, I was immediately drawn in by the ambience of faint chirps, buzzing, hisses, and yelps in the beginning of the movie. It's subtle, but it's there, and it really adds to the story's introduction. More than just being a fun little thing the director put in, those noises remind us, the audience, of the many potential dangers that could lurk around every corner. A real two birds, one stone situation. And I don't know, that kind of subtle detail work just captures your attention. It makes the movie feel more immersive, and I love it. I also wanted to take a second to talk about the pastel skies we see throughout the movie because, wow, this movie throws blues and reds and purples and greens and just about every other color you can think of together to pull off some of the warmest and most beautiful backgrounds I have ever seen. The Lamp for Time is set in a world riddled with catastrophic natural disasters, dangerous predators, and famine, yet the artistry made it feel almost inviting at times, and that's no small feat. This is a small thing, but I also love how the artist would throw in mountains and cliffs and trees into the background of almost every scene to establish depth. It serves drawing the audience of just how massive this world is. A massive world, their five dino babies need to march across if they're to reach the Great Valley. It's beautiful, but again, it's also foreboding. Yet another reminder of how difficult this journey is going to be for our tiny protagonists. The music score is also nothing to sneeze at. It's powerful. I hadn't remembered how beautiful the movie sounded until my rewatch. Every scene was flawlessly punctuated by just the most elegant orchestral music I have ever heard. I don't know enough about music to speak to the actual production of such a score, but I can absolutely appreciate it nonetheless. As for the designs of the dinosaurs themselves, the animators make each different species move in a unique way. The long necks, as for instance, bob their heads up and down with each step they take. Meanwhile, the swimmers are wobbly and almost limp when they walk on land, which stands in stark contrast for how we see Ducky glide effortlessly throughout the water while she's swimming. Meanwhile, the three horns move more steadily, and this might be me reading too much into it, but they seem to move with more authority and confidence than the other species. And of course, the flyers are the smoothest in their movements. It's creative decisions like that that make every species feel so separate from the others. They're wholly unique. The art style itself is Disney-esque, with characters having large eyes and eyelashes. There's also little to no sharp edges. Instead, the designs are comprised of mostly soft lines, and there are these occasional rolls of skin that frames characters' limbs. Everything seems bottom heavy too. Smaller heads on top of chubby bodies and big feet are to be expected on just about every character who, I guess, isn't a flyer, as they still have tiny little twig legs. That particular artistic flourish reminds me quite a bit of Chris Sanders and how he draws his characters. For those of you who don't know, he was the artist behind Lilo and Stitch. I talk about him a lot on my channel, but yeah, it reminded me a lot of his particular art style, which is something that I myself am very fond of. The ambience, the music, the colors chosen, and the backgrounds fold seamlessly into one another. Any one of those things could have been left out of the movie, and a lesser movie might have cut corners by doing just that. But this film really went all out in the world building department. It set it apart from its contemporary All Dogs Go to Heaven while also allowing it to contend with Oliver and Company. Needless to say, when it comes to world building, I'm a big fan of how they handle it here, and I think it still holds up. The story we're presented with here is pretty straightforward on the surface. We follow our protagonist, a young apatosaurus named Littlefoot, while he treks across the ever changing, dangerous world in search of a paradise known as the Great Valley. Along his journey, Littlefoot loses his mother to a T Rex attack, or Sharptooth attack, as it's referred to in the film, ostensibly becoming orphaned early on in the story. Through his grief, the young dinosaur needs to press on, befriending a couple of unlikely strangers while doing so. It's only together that Littlefoot and his newfound family can make it to the Great Valley. The runtime of this movie is an hour and 9 minutes. It was actually cut back from its initial 80-minute runtime. I read that some of those scenes were removed to make it less scary or disturbing for kids, but I really wish that they kept them in, or at least finish animating those scenes and put them on a separate version of Lamp for Time, which I guess is asking a lot. But based on what I know of those cut scenes, I do think they would have added quite a bit to the movie. Despite the incredibly short runtime, quite a lot is actually covered here. There are a lot of discussions of grief and overcoming loss, namely from the perspective of a child. It's sort of personal, but I resonate with that message a lot growing up because of a loss I experienced at a pretty young age. And I know I'm not alone in that. It's hard to talk about death at any age, but especially to kids. So, on that front, I think what the story manages to do here is pretty useful, especially since it's so well done. I was shocked on my rewatch of just how powerful those themes still were and how much they still resonate with me to this day. Littlefoot crying about his mother in the dark during a rainy night, him begging for her to please get up. His tone suggests that he knows what was happening but refuses to accept it all the same, as if he can convince or talk his mom out of dying. It's tragic. And it's tragic in a way I haven't seen any other kids movie do before or since. But more than that, it's honest, as anyone who's ever been so unfortunate as to experience it can tell you. I think it's important to have those honest types of discussions, namely with kids, or at least it was for me. And Left for Time doesn't unalive the protagonist's mom just to move on from a short time later, like Disney's Bambi sort of does, in my opinion. The movie also doesn't separate the main character from their guardian as a plot device to usher in some big life changing adventure that they wouldn't otherwise go on. Like we see in A New Hope or Hercules to an extent, or Fox and the Hound, among a number of others. It's a pretty common trope, but here, whether Littlefoot's mom is alive or not, his goal didn't change. It just got harder. He still needs to make it to the Great Valley if he has any chance of surviving. Only now, he needs to do it while wrestling with the enormous amount of grief and without the obvious protection a grown adult dinosaur would offer. And he would have done it alone too if he hadn't happened to run into other children in mirrored situations to his own, which again is such an honest way of approaching the subject matter, in my opinion. I really appreciate having this theme play out and sort of resolve itself over the course of Littlefoot's journey to the Great Valley. I plan on diving into the themes a bit later in this video, but I needed to mention it here because, let's be honest, that scene of Littlefoot and his mother is what everyone remembers from that movie. It rivals, like I said earlier, and I think even surpasses Bambi in both its brutality and realism. It really sticks with you, whether you wanted to or not, quite frankly. The Land for Time centers around five young dinosaurs, with Littlefoot being the main character and Sarah, a Triceratops, being the lead supporting character. We also have Ducky, a bubbly Saurolophus, Spike, a Stegosaurus, and Petrie, a pterodactyl. I enjoy how big and different these characters' personalities are from one another. In addition to that, over the course of the movie, all, or I guess most, of these characters have arcs of varied sizes and importance to the story that they all go through. First up is Petrie. Petrie is known as a flyer in the movie, only he starts off not being able to fly. Petrie is loud, scared, and rambunctious in a way that almost makes me anxious. Or at least it does now. Growing up, he and Ducky were my absolute favorite characters. He's responsible for much of the comedic relief we get. When we're first introduced to him, he falls from a tree, startling both Littlefoot and Ducky. It's revealed soon after that he can't fly, an admission that is followed by the other two characters reassuring him that it's okay actually because, quote, we can't do it either. It's funny and cute how reflexively these two move on to comfort a stranger who's obviously insecure about not being able to live up to his namesake. That happens again later on when the kids find a tree with leaves up high that they just can't reach. They work to convince the little pterodactyl to try his hand at flying and securing the five of them some food. He insists he can't, but instead of getting angry with him, Ducky eases his anxieties by telling him that plenty of things can't fly, like rocks or Spike. Instead of forcing Petrie to do something he can't do or isn't ready to do, Littlefoot, Spike, and Ducky all work together with Petrie to climb the tree and knock piles of leaves onto the ground for them. They're a team. And more than that, they're becoming a family. This arc is concluded for our flyer friend when he unlocks his flight in a moment of desperation. He escapes a hungry Sharptooth by flying high up in the air and away from danger. There isn't much time to celebrate though, because this usually timid creature dives back into danger without hesitation, might I add, to save his friend, Ducky, who had become a victim of the Sharptooth attention. The movie ends with Petrie reuniting with his family, literally blowing them away with the powerful gust of wind he produces by flapping his wings hard mid flight. Side note, but I can't help but feel that there's at least a chance that Petrie didn't just get separated from his family by pure happenstance. Unlike the others, he never mentions being separated. Instead, he fixates on not being able to fly, as if he was left behind on purpose, maybe? His mother needed to get his siblings to safety, and Petrie wouldn't have been able to keep up. That could explain how excited his mother was when he showed off that he could fly when he made it to the Great Valley. Him being able to fly isn't just a cool party trick, but it would be his way of telling his family that they'd never be separated again. Because he can keep up with them now. Much like everything else about this movie, it's tragic, but it's also beautiful in a way. I'm torn because my heart doesn't want to believe Petrie was abandoned, but I do think it adds to the story and his struggles and insecurities in particular. I could totally be off here, but that was just the impression I got from the movie upon my rewatch. So let me know what you guys think about that. Let's talk about Spike next. Spike doesn't have much of a story. Just like with Petrie, he mostly serves as to offer funny, lighthearted moments amongst the chaos, or at least comedic relief is the more obvious box for him to fit into. Taking a more critical approach to analyzing his character, I couldn't help but notice that Spike is the only kid in the group that doesn't have a family to return to at the end of the story. Sure, Ducky and her family adopt him, but we never see his parents. And interestingly, neither does Spike himself. To that point, I always thought it was funny how Spike looked unbothered by the whole journey to the Great Valley. Like he followed Ducky and his friends, but as an adult, I think his leisurely behavior is more than just whimsical. It also makes sense to me. Of course, he wouldn't be operating with a sense of urgency because he's just a baby. Like Littlefoot at the start of the movie, he's just thrown into this world against his will, might I add, and doesn't know much of anything. What's more, he doesn't have a concept of needing to reunite with his parents or siblings in the way that the other four do. All he's ever known are the people he's currently with. We're not heading to find his family. He's literally traveling with his family, just like Littlefoot, Ducky, and Sarah were in the beginning of the film. In some ways, he's a reminder of what these kids' lives should be like, and part of what the Great Valley promises them. They should be able to eat when they're hungry, to keep eating until their bellies are full, and kids should be allowed to be clumsy and clueless. They shouldn't need to worry about stressing over these bloodthirsty predators or a famine. They're kids, and they deserve to be just that. Ducky is a sweet angel baby who's never done anything wrong in her entire life, and I love her for it. We're introduced to this little ball of joy early on in the movie. She's actually the first of the group we see. In fact, her introduction helps to set the tone for the rest of the movie. A sweet, newly hatched ducky chased the butterfly, which, I mean, come on. What's a more perfect expression of childhood innocence than gleefully chasing butterflies with wide eyes and a smile on your face? Just seconds later, she's nearly decapitated when her curiosity gets the better of her and she decides it's a good idea to peek inside of Snapping Turtle's mouth. She's saved by one of her dutiful parents who returned her to the nest where she and her siblings could play and where Ducky could continue to laugh. That ability to smile and joke through even the ugliest of situations is perhaps her greatest strength. She meets a grieving Littlefoot near the water's edge, and he's distant and despondent, but Ducky is resilient. She asks him for his name, and when he doesn't immediately answer, she assumes that he must not be able to talk because that made more sense to her than for the stranger to be simply ignoring her. Littlefoot finally responds with some racist rhetoric he heard first from Sarah's dad, and then again from his own mother. He says, "Don't you know, longists don't talk to, whatever you are." The swimmer stretches out her neck to impersonate the same species dinosaur she's currently talking to and says it's okay if they talk because she's actually a long neck just like him. Realizing he wasn't buying it, she stops joking and instead opens up about how she was separated from her family and is all alone. That seems to be enough to break through Littlefoot as he smiles and invites Ducky to journey with him to the Great Valley. These two laugh and play around, and it's the first time we see our main protagonist so much as smile since losing his mother. Ducky brings that out in him. I think a huge part of what makes her character so endearing is her incredible voice acting that was being done by Judith Barcy. So I had been going back and forth on whether or not I should cover the tragedy of what happened to Judith Barcy. I don't want this video to turn into some gratuitous true crime documentary that tries to capitalize off of the death of a young girl, but I do think it should at least be mentioned. I learned of her murder when I was pretty young, and I don't know, I think it always colored my viewing experience of both Lamp for Time and All Dogs Go to Heaven. I'll be quick, but for anyone who has no interest in this portion of the video, feel free to jump ahead just a couple of minutes. Judith Barcy spent her short life subjected to abuse, both verbal and physical, at the hand of her father, Joseph Barcy. While the young girl continued to rise in Hollywood, securing roles in the Fourth Jaw movie, The Twilight Zone, The Lamp for Time, and All Dogs Go to Heaven, she unfortunately found no reprieve from her father. These violent tendencies came to a head in July of 1988 when the then 10-year-old, along with her mother, were shot dead by Joseph. Rewatching the movie with that murder in mind, it's hard not to get choked up a bit every time Ducky laughs and repeats, "Yup, yup, yup," gleefully. Judith's character is the light of the film, and based on every report I've read about her, it was the same for her in her life, too. Sarah is racist. From that stems a sense of pridefulness and arrogance that shows itself in ways that almost get her killed several times within this short hour-long movie. When it comes to the group, though, she achieves maybe the most growth, specifically so far as it relates to self-improvement, which makes sense because for most of the movie, she's pretty terrible, and she would need to change and overcome quite a bit in some pretty big ways if the audience was ever going to see her as a protagonist. She starts off being brash and hard-headed, and she ends things, well, still being brash and hard-headed, but she learns to check her ego and help species of dinosaurs she once thought were below her. The bar is pretty low, but she does ultimately clear it, at least in my opinion. Littlefoot met her on accident when he sees Sarah trying to squish a beetle. She's crashing around, unsuccessfully connecting with her target. After mishap, Littlefoot's laugh reveals his location. She confronts him. She looks to be both angry while also coming across as maybe playful. Sarah and Littlefoot run at each other when Sarah's father, Daddy Tops, jumps between them. He's angry, disgusted even by the very notion that his daughter might mingle with a species other than his own. Three-horns never play with long necks, the adult lectured, a phrase that his daughter repeats uncritically and quite frankly without hesitation. Those 5 words are a window into Sarah's entire worldview. When the Sharptooth first shows up, Sarah disregards Littlefoot when he tells her, "Come back, you're going the wrong way." Yes, she's scared and I'm sure not thinking rationally. And on its own, this wouldn't be enough evidence to point to that she thinks less of Longneck's opinions and that doing so is even a bad idea. That example doesn't meaningfully challenge what she believes. She was scared, so she ran. Simple as that. However, we see that behavior a second time following the death of Littlefoot's mom. Sarah's offered a chance to travel with Littlefoot to the Great Valley, but she declines with Three-horns don't need help from Longnecks after sliding down into a canyon in hopes of crossing a ravine to find her family. While moving further away, being swallowed by the shadows she spews, we only talk to other Three-horns and we only travel with other Three-horns. Her doing so almost gets her eaten again by the exact same predator, might I add. So that pattern repeats itself yet again much later in the film, where Sarah, Ducky, Petrie, and Spike are all being led to the Great Valley by the young Longneck, but the path has exhausted Sarah and the others, so she decides to just go in another direction. a direction that she convinces all but Littlefoot would be, quote, easier. It's her opinion against his, right? She tried things his way and it was brutal, so they might as well try things Sarah's. Except, no. Sarah has no idea where she's going. Littlefoot and Littlefoot alone has something of a roadmap to their mutually agreed upon location. Sarah, on the other hand, takes for granted that her guest must be just as reliable as what the Longneck was told by his mother. She even says exactly that while engaged in a heated debate with Littlefoot. You're going the wrong way, Littlefoot warned. Who says? Sarah asks. My mother, he retorts. Then she was a stupid Longneck too. That argument has always stuck with me. Littlefoot's mother was responsible for saving the young Three-Horn's life. And more than that, she gave her own life to do so. Yet Sarah is quick to dismiss this hero the second her own judgment is called into question. Ultimately, she was wrong. So wrong, in fact, that she almost gets Ducky, Spike, and Petrie killed just a short while later. I think it's fair to be critical of Sarah and her abhorrent ideology, not only because her words are damaging in and of themselves in canon, but she literally puts people in danger while clinging to the gross mindset of her father. I will say, and this isn't meant to be in any sort of way of defense of Sarah, but we see the youngster clinging to these racist frameworks long after she separated from her family. Maybe even more so then, which isn't surprising considering that at that point those values are all she has left of her family. As long as she holds true to what she's taught, they're not totally gone. Not completely, unlike what Littlefoot experiences with his own mother. Only instead of being brought up to rely on his heart, Sarah was instead groomed to think of herself as superior. I suppose it must be easier to uncritically accept that framework when you're surrounded by your fellow elites, but what happens when, well, you're not? Instead, you rely on the very creatures you were told to despise. Time and time again, Sarah was saved, fed, and led by those she thought who were below her. Reality butted up against her morals, and we saw Sarah push against reality many times during the movie. She'd lash out to all of those around her or ignore them altogether. I'm reminded of that scene where Petrie and the others, except for Sarah, work together to climb to the top of the tree to secure food. The 300 refuses to help and then brags about how independent she was before finding a space to sleep alone. She plays up how she doesn't need anyone else, and it's sort of over the top and theatrical in a way. In fact, it's so over the top at times that the others don't even bother taking it seriously, on more than one occasion, might I add. That night, when Sarah motions to sleep alone, she's soon met by Spike, Ducky, and Petrie. Not long after that, each of the three others, one by one, leaves to instead keep Littlefoot company while he slept. Sarah wakes up alone. She should be fine with that, right? That's what she wanted after all, isn't it? Well, not exactly. Sarah was performing the bullheadedness that she was raised and steeped in, but she didn't want to be alone, I don't think, which is shown by the sad expression on her face when she realizes how cold and terrible her ideology was in practice. She gets up and she too snuggles with her friends. She's forced to, for the first time, really challenge her family's teachings, and she's all the better for it. We see this behavior again at the end of Lamp for Time when, after Sarah fights with Littlefoot, when she says his mother must have been a stupid long neck too, she almost gets her friends unalived. The movie cuts to Sarah being attacked by what I believe are a trio of Pachyceralosauruses. I'm going to put the spelling of that up on the screen if you guys wanted to look at that and let me know in the comments how to pronounce it. I was pretty confident when I put it in here that I would be able to pronounce it, but just now having to read it, I fear I was wrong. So let me know. Anyways, the others arrive in a giant goo mass, which scares those dinosaurs away. And in that moment, Sarah is scared and reflexively cries out for her friends, only to find out that it was, in fact, her friends that did save her. She was embarrassed, humiliated even. The narrator tells us she was too proud to admit that she had gone the wrong way, a mindset that I imagine was only exacerbated by her being scared by Littlefoot, Ducky, Spike, and Petrie. Sarah cries alone behind a waterfall. Not only was she wrong, her, the almighty Triceratops, but she needed to be saved by her friends. Once again, she's forced to confront what she was taught, what she believed to be true for so much of her life. Ultimately, she decides to return to her friends, and by doing so, she delivers the final blow, taking out the Sharptooth from the beginning of the film. Then, she puts her faith into Littlefoot, and because of that, she's led to the Great Valley and is reunited with her family. So, I'm sure you've heard the saying, children are like sponges. When they come into this world, they aren't critical of any of the lessons they're being taught, but a lot of the time, they aren't even aware that being critical is an option. This is a pretty broad generalization, of course, and surely doesn't apply to every family, I admit. But for a lot of us, I'm sure there was a time in our lives where we sort of stepped back and stopped seeing our parents as these perfect heroes, but instead starting to recognize them as just people. Just like you, only, I don't know, older, I guess. They make mistakes, and sometimes have really, really bad opinions. Some opinions, like whether or not to keep your shoes on in the house, as for instance, are mundane, but others, like the sort that Daddy Top spewed, have tendency of actually hurting people in the real world. It takes time to grow up and sift through the nonsense we're fed by our parents. It takes years, decades sometimes, to fully become our own person. Sarah achieved a lot of growth over this 1 hour runtime, but she wasn't completely free of those teachings by the end of it. In fact, that's sort of a through line in some of the upcoming films as well. It takes hours and hours of runtime to move on from and reject that mindset. By the time you get to movie 6 or, I don't know, 7, it's easy to forget how bigoted she started out. Ultimately, she acts as a foil to Lidfoot himself. She grows and learns to let go of what her parents taught her. Meanwhile, reality essentially primes Littlefoot to cling tighter to what he was taught. Speaking of Littlefoot, let's talk about him. Littlefoot is what I would call a perfectly flawed protagonist. He's inquisitive and a loyal friend. He's also brave and has a strong sense of justice. But make no mistake, baked into his character is a bit of a temper, and sometimes he even exhibits a hunger for revenge. One of those flaws, I think, ground him, make him a tad more relatable. The other, maybe not so much. Throughout the movie, he needs to learn to mourn the death of his mother, hopefully doing so in a healthy way. He ends up making mistakes, which, I mean, of course he does. There is no one size fits all recipe for how to handle the loss of a loved one, and even if there were, humans are slaves to their emotions. Knowing what to do and being able to emotionally do that are completely different for anyone, namely a kid. Despite the difficulty in such a task, Littlefoot succeeds. In the direct aftermath of the T Rex attack, when he became orphaned, we saw Littlefoot grow distant and despondent. He moves through the world as if in a daze. He stumbles over a larger green dinosaur. She should have known better, he says to the stranger. There was a Sharptooth, he continued, and with that, the green dinosaur knows what happened. He then offers some life advice to the youngster. He says, and you'll always miss her, but she'll always be with you so long as you remember what she taught you. He claims it'll get easier, but only in time. And the dialogue from the old green dinosaur was meant to sort of reinforce and remind Littlefoot of a message they hear toward the beginning of the movie. His mother explained to him how different and easy life would be once they made it to the Great Valley, And the ever inquisitive Littlefoot asks her how she knows, and she responds by telling him that some things you know with your heart. The heart motif is reinstated while the mother Longneck is on her deathbed. She tells him to let your heart guide you. It's fitting advice for a character like Littlefoot because he's nothing but heart. After meeting the green dinosaur, it still takes Littlefoot some time to come to terms with what he experienced, what had happened to him and to his mom. He doesn't just snap out of it after receiving some sage advice, and I really appreciate the film for that. In spite of the short runtime, this movie doesn't rush much of anything, or at least it doesn't rush this particular storyline, which I think is the most important. Many times we see Sarah push Littlefoot and challenge what he knows to be true, how to find the Great Valley. But despite her brashness and cruelty at times, Littlefoot never gives up on trying to help her. He knows a few rude comments aren't worth her losing her life, and in a way, I believe she and Littlefoot are sort of trauma bonded. Littlefoot's mother died saving both of them, so if his mom thought Sarah was worth saving, why too wouldn't he? This isn't to say he always pulls his punches while interacting with Sarah, and I can't blame him because the young Three-Horn can be a lot sometimes. And as kids, they even go blow to blow sometimes when Sarah insists on insulting his mom and calling her stupid. But even then, when Sarah leaves to find herself near death, Littlefoot isn't far behind and is ready to save her. Families fight. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but some of the worst fights I've ever had were with my siblings. It's part of growing up. You learn how to handle those altercations and how to properly socialize with your peers. The love Littlefoot is known for isn't so feeble as to be erased by name calling, and I think his mother would be proud. Okay, so enough of the lovey-dovey stuff for just a brief moment. The temper Littlefoot demonstrates is perfectly justified in his situation. I doubt most of us would have responded any differently. However, the mini murder side quest he embarks on toward the end of the movie doesn't quite work for me. I have a whole section coming up that talks about the Sharptooth and their place in the story overall, and I'll be getting to more detail then. But I just really don't like the scene where the kids kill them. It feels rushed and tacked on. More than that, I have a hard time believing Littlefoot's bloodlust is so strong they'd be willing to endanger his friends, his new family, in order to get revenge. There was also no buildup. The Sharptooth just seems to manifest whenever things are too quiet for too long. There's a movie that I think actually handles a similar premise. Well, okay, so now that I'm thinking about it, it's actually just fully the same plot. Wow. Um, Stay with me here, but I think 2000's movie Dinosaur does a much better job at establishing a lingering predator. They have what are known as carnivores, and those antagonists spend almost the entirety of the film actively tracking down a herd of dinosaurs, heading to what I'm pretty sure is just meant to be called the Great Valley, although in this movie it's called the Nesting Grounds. At the end of the movie, the Carnotaurs catch up with the main cast. The good guys need to kill the bad guys, or else they'll never be able to make it to the Great Valley or like, nesting grounds, I guess. By doing this, creatives establish both a reason for the heroes to kill and a reason for the predators to be there, which is helpful because people usually don't love it when the good guys decide to commit murder in a way that isn't self defense. And And just as important, it gives agency to the antagonist. They're living, thinking creatures who didn't just stumble upon their prey 3 times in an hour, but rather they're hunting them down. It adds tension. I remember being at the edge of my seat while watching Dinosaur, wondering when and where the bad guys were going to show up. Although now that I'm thinking of it, I think it could have been a more compelling story might have been if instead of Littlefoot dropping the rock on the T-Rex for a means of revenge, he did it while the T-Rex was trying to enter the Great Valley, and it would have caused him and his friends to need to act with urgency. They drop the rock to block Sharptooth from entering the Great Valley, and by doing so, he just so happened to kill the same Sharptooth who killed his mom. So less of an action of hatred and more so one of love, if that makes sense. Although now that I'm thinking about it, that only works if Littlefoot is the last dino to make it to the Great Valley. Otherwise, some other poor, sorry band of orphans would be stuck in the mysterious beyond for, I don't know, presumably an eternity. I don't know. Sucks to suck, I guess. My point is, I think what we got was pretty weak on that front, and I appreciate an action sequence as much as anyone else, but this just kind of falls flat to me. It's an action sequence, but for the sake of being an action sequence, I just wanted more. I wanted it to add to the story, and in my opinion, it just didn't. I want to talk about Littlefoot's mom. Learning to cope with loss is difficult in the best of times, let alone in the worst of them. Littlefoot's mother, let's call her Mama Neck. So we have Daddy Tops, Mama Neck. Got it? Good. So Mama Neck raised her son to trust his instincts and to lead with kindness. So to let his heart guide him, if you will. More than just doling out untested advice, though, the adult was herself an exemplary of those very teachings. Despite being confronted by Daddy Tops early on when his daughter Sarah was in danger, Mama Neck led with her own heart and didn't hesitate to defend her against the Sharptooth. There were not one, but two separate occasions during the attack where she flew into action to protect both Sarah and Littlefoot, something that I'm sure helped influence Littlefoot's behavior later on, as I said earlier. Of course, she saves our main protagonist and gives her son the five-word phrase, let your heart guide you, to help direct him to the Great Valley, but I believe Mama Neck had a much larger role here in practice. One that, at least for me, transcends a TV screen. She's the catalyst for teaching the audience about loss. Her death is, I think, one of the most tragic death scenes in all of cinema, certainly of animation. That might be a tad hyperbolic for some of you, but I stand by it. It's gruesome. We see literal chunks of Mama Neck being ripped off her body by the T Rex. It shakes Littlefoot to his core and fundamentally changes him. He doesn't have the luxury of shutting down and refusing to eat for too long, or else he'd himself die, and Mama Neck's sacrifice would have been for naught. Quickly, if I may, Littlefoot uses the premise of the Great Valley given to him by his mother to build his decisions throughout the movie. But I don't think he abides by all of her teachings so blindly. So, okay, early on, Littlefoot's mother also explains to Littlefoot how different species live and play separately. But rather quickly, we see our protagonist do away with that mindset the first chance he had. I think it just didn't feel authentic to him, her telling him that. His heart told him that his mother was right about the valley, while also telling him that the trek with a multi species coalition was also fine. I bring this up because, although it might not seem like it, Littlefoot is still doing what Mama Neck taught him by traveling with Sarah, Spike, Ducky, and Petrie. Yes, she might have told him that long necks and three horns don't do anything together, but she showed him that other species were worth fighting for. Littlefoot did what he knew was right rather than being a slave to what he was told the status quo was, even if that message was told to him by that exact same person. Does that make sense? The Great Valley would serve as a physical reprieve from the threat of starvation, predators, drought, and the kids would be reunited, or I guess in Spike's case, just regular united with their families. But functionally, the valley symbolizes Littlefoot coming to terms with his parent being gone. The clouds literally part, and for the first time, we're treated to a bright and beautiful, familiar looking landscape, which, might I add, happened only after Littlefoot is guided to the paradise by the literal voice of his mother. The stranger green dinosaur from the beginning of the film was right. His mother would always be with him so long as he remembered what she taught him. It's evident with every time he speaks to his friends that it's in no small part because of how he was brought up, because of his mother. The same goes for the Valley. Every day he gets to run around and play under a blue sky, and again, it's because of his mother. She's dead, but not gone. Showing kids that death is forever, no matter how much we might beg to the contrary, is important. Littlefoot begging for his mother to get up did nothing. Not because he didn't love her enough for the magic of friendship to kick in, but because that's the way the world works sometimes. It's also important to show how, even though someone is no longer with us, their ideals can still transcend even the most tragic of deaths. If you remember something someone once said or did, and the thought of them occupies space in your mind, then they are still with you in a way. I appreciate the Lamp for Time for undertaking this plot and storyline, and I think it's as relevant today as it was in '88 when it was released. This part of the movie absolutely still holds up. The Sharptooth angle of the story is honestly pretty boring to me now as an adult. I mean, I enjoyed the fight scene between Littlefoot and his mom growing up. It's terrifying, and more than that, it's iconic. I found it suspenseful, and it did a good job at kicking off the movie's plot. Without a dead mom, a protagonist wouldn't be able to go on this adventure and grow up in the exact way that he had. However, I wonder if maybe the Sharptooth should have died when Littlefoot's mom did. The character is largely unimportant to the story beyond that point. So what I'm saying is the Sharptooth didn't need to be a recurring character in the movie. I think it works better for them to be a stand-in for the hardships and the myriad of other predators in this world. Think about it. The kids need to make it to the Great Valley in order to survive an ongoing famine, natural disasters, and carnivores. The Sharptooth could have just been one of those carnivores. It didn't have to be the carnivore. The main conflict should have been Littlefoot overcoming grief and him learning to let others in after such a loss. I think some movies get carried away with the idea of needing a big bad in order to add more conflict and gravity to the plot. The story is so strong even without that added bit, and I think this particular movie suffers from it. I mean, it's not even like the Sharptooth was tracking Littlefoot and Sarah throughout the movie. After it killed his mom, it went on its way. It was by pure happenstance that their paths crossed again and again. Not much buildup, it just happened. And that's poor writing. The design and atmosphere surrounding the Sharptooth is nothing short of immaculate, I'll admit. They're terrifying. They're easily the scariest Sharptooth in the entirety of this franchise, no doubt because they're the only one to have actually killed a beloved character, and they did so in such a dynamic fight scene. There was a massive franchise tone shift after the first movie, which is evident in the first film being the only one that isn't a musical. The following movies still have action sequences, of course, but nothing quite like the original. Don't get me wrong, I remember feeling some tension seeing the Velociraptors in The Land for Time 3 or the evil Sharptooth in the fifth movie, but there was never any fear. I knew that none of the main characters would die or even get seriously injured. What I was watching was basically a game of tag, but with a few extra steps. To this day, my heart still races during the scene where the T Rex has both Sarah and Littlefoot pinned under a branch while he tries to sniff for them. What Don Bluth and Spielberg came up with here was truly special for that fight scene. Now, from my understanding, the original cut of the movie included between 10 and 13 minutes of additional runtime. That might not seem like a lot, but considering that's a sixth of this movie length, I think it's safe to assume that that chunk of missing footage could have really impacted this final product. Among what was snipped, I read that some of the Sharptooth attack related content was removed for being too scary for kids, but that wasn't all. There was also a clip of Ducky contouring her face in an attempt to distract the Sharptooth. that doesn't really have anything to do with what I'm talking about here, but I wanted to show you guys. God, I love it's so good. I love Ducky, the best character in this entire movie by far. Anyways, do you know how I mentioned 2000 Dinosaur and how I thought they handled their antagonists better than Land for Time by adding a level of agency to their predators? Well, apparently, the Sharptooth in this movie was supposed to have found the Great Valley, and that was going to be what forced Littlefoot's hand in trying to eliminate him. I swear I didn't know that when I got to that point in my script earlier. Something just felt off about how things unfolded. So then I looked it up afterwards. This was a massive miss on the part of the creatives. And I think the additional minute or two of dialogue establishing a stronger motivation for Littlefoot's murder lust might have made all the difference. Otherwise, things feel underthought out and rushed. This is a rare miss for the movie, in my opinion. Racism is always a touchy subject to discuss and portray in media. I think it's important to talk about, but what's more important is that it's talked about well, which I'm not sure the Lamp for Time does here. I mean, I guess it's serviceable at points, but I wish Bluth and others would have pushed it further, like they did for the grief angle of the story. We are told several times during the first 10 minutes of the movie that racism is very much real in this universe, but there isn't much of a value judgment made while discussing it, at least not at first. As an adult, I know that racism is wrong, but a 4-year-old tuning in for the first time might not have that same inclination. Now, I'm not saying that movies have a responsibility to teach life lessons to kids necessarily. Some movies should be allowed to just be escapist by nature. But if you're going to introduce racism to your story, I think you do have a responsibility to challenge that framework, to explain to the audience why that's wrong and why the people, or in this case, dinosaurs, who live by that ideology are themselves wrong. Daddy Tops and Sarah are sort of the poster children for that theme within this movie. In fact, they don't just believe that different species of dinosaurs should live separately, which is terrible in and of itself, but rather they believe that they're superior to the rest. They're quite literally Triceratops supremacists that is borne out in the rhetoric of both the first movie, then built up on in a few of the sequels. We see Daddy Tops still continuing on with his bigoted ways when the Great Valley undergoes a drought in Land for Time 3, The Great Giving. He's quick to elect himself in charge of monitoring the different herds' drinking habits, and Daddy Tops routinely stereotypes the different species to attack them at every single given opportunity that he has. In the first movie, we know Sarah and her dad are mean because they bully the lovable Littlefoot. It's through the lens of that we are introduced to how damaging that worldview is. But you'd be wrong to assume that racism is a three-horn problem exclusively. Littlefoot's mom tells a child about how the different herds never do anything together because they're just so different. When Littlefoot presses her on it further, she laughs and tells him not to worry about it because, quote, when we make it to the Great Valley, there'll be plenty of other long necks for you to play with. In later installments, we see even more examples of long neck centered racism along with the Flyers as well. Now, I argued before that Mama Neck's words and actions don't match when it comes to racism, which is mostly true, I think, but it would be dishonest to believe that racism and hatred are one and the same. Racism and hatred could go hand in hand, of course, but that's hardly a prerequisite. One of the first lessons the Littlefoot learns when he's orphaned is that his mother was actually wrong when she told him how different the different species were. And she was wrong for suggesting that that was justification for them living separately. I believe Mama Neck was coming from the angle of this is just how things are rather than this is how things ought to be. But I don't know how much that matters functionally here. If someone steps on your foot, whether the other person means to or not might matter to you, but say the interaction caused you to break your foot, to your doctor, whether the injury was intentional or malicious or not doesn't matter all that much. The damage is still the same either way. If everyone treats the system like this is how it ought to be, then that is how the system is going to be, whether you do it with hate in your heart or not. From my understanding, there were scenes cut from the movie where the gang would interact with two separate groups of dinosaurs. One had ample food while the other had water. These two groups refused to come together and share the resources, though, because they were different species. The kids see this, and I imagine it would have started Sarah on her path of self improvement and self discovery. I'm being nitpicky here, I know, but I also don't love the noting of not being racist because you need something from other people that you're currently being racist to. To me, it's a stronger message to remove that utility from the discussion. It's wrong to treat others unfairly and look down on them because they're people too. They deserve the same level of respect that you do by just virtue of existing. And sure, maybe there would be some benefits like sharing resources that could later come from that, but not every relationship needs to be or should be transactional. Maybe my thoughts would soften on the deleted scene if I actually had watched it growing up, but those are my thoughts based on the articles I've read describing it. I also can't help but wonder what the existence of the Sharptooth says about the racism of this world, if that really is an intended theme here. Dinos shouldn't segregate except Sharptooth because they're actually bad. But what about Chomper from the second movie? Is he just one of the good ones? I don't know. The racism thread is thin and perhaps not a story you want to tell while also continually explaining to the audience that some dinosaurs are bloodthirsty monsters that will kill your mother if given half the chance. I don't know. Maybe the only prejudice we're meant to look at is between herbivores and carnivores are exempt. Like, they're more forces of nature than sentient beings, like the main cast of dinosaurs, which could explain why the Sharptooth doesn't speak. That would also make sense because how would you possibly be expected to live in harmony with someone hell bent on eating you, right? Except there's a whole story arc in the next movie of why the same racism applies to Sharptooth, a storyline that is then even doubled down on and left for time the mysterious island when it's shown that not only Chomper but his parents display levels of competency and sympathy towards Littlefoot and the gang. They even introduce a bad Sharptooth to sort of offer a juxtaposition and show the level of humanity that the species is actually capable of. So, what's the message here? I get it. Allegories are generally meant to be pretty vague. They allow for creatives to sometimes explore very complicated, broad topics and get those across to audiences without being too hamstrung by a narrow set of potential storylines. Think of 1992's Fern Gully, The Last Rainforest. The antagonist is climate change, but the movie chooses to personify this complicated and high concept idea by introducing an evil goo monster being voiced by the dastardly Tim Curry. You take something giant and complicated, break it down to its most basic parts, then you pursue that instead. Movies can only be so long after all, so I understand what's being done here. I just don't think it sticks the landing, quite frankly. I think instead the film would have been much better served having just the three horns be the racist stand-ins. Sarah needs to be the only child struggling with it during the course of the movie, and it helps to sort of streamline the plot a little bit if she is, and it does away with the inconsistencies that we end up with both in this first movie but also in the movies to come. We still would get to explore that damaging worldview, which I believe is a worldview that kids should be exposed to, but in a way that doesn't immediately start to come apart under any level of scrutiny. I want to be generous here and speculate that Chomper is, I don't know, maybe fundamentally different from the other Sharptooth we see in this franchise, in no small part because of his relationship with the main cast. I think it's pretty obvious that those interactions early on were pivotal in shaping the little T Rex. Later in the mysterious island, we see that kindness that was shown to Chomper spread to his parents when they fight to protect the five young dinos from the bad Sharptooth. I think it's fair to speculate that these carnivores are raised to behave the way that they are instead of it being a biological imperative, which, in my opinion, that actually makes it tragic considering that Sharptooth continued to be the main antagonist in most of the upcoming movies. I'm being pretty pedantic here, and I know I think it's pretty obvious that the creatives just wanted to find a reason to shoehorn the iconic T Rex into the main cast of Young Dinosaurs and didn't give much thought at the same time of how it might complicate the already established canon. And I love Chomper, so I was tempted to just ignore the inconsistencies, but I ultimately decided that, I don't know, it would be worth at least mentioning those and let you guys decide how you feel about it on your own end. If you disagree with my take here, I'd love to hear why that is. Please comment down below. This is where I fall on the topic, but I'm open to having my mind changed. But for now, I don't think the portrayal of this theme still holds up today. When I started writing the script for this video, I had the tone under the category doesn't hold up, but upon my rewatch and with further analysis, I have to say that I still think it works remarkably well. To clarify, I was at first operating under the understanding that this was a kids' movie that was just absolutely littered with grim subject matter and violence, but now I see things sort of differently. I guess I just realized that calling something a kids' movie is sort of a nothing phrase. All movies can be broken down into any number of subgenres. The Lamp for Time is a tragedy at its bones with occasional moments of daylight. That swap, in my perspective, really made all the difference. Of course, this is still a kids' movie, but not in the way that The Little Mermaid is or that The Toy Story is. This has some grit to it. I mean, this movie opens up with a sweet baby ducky almost being decapitated just seconds after hatching. I don't think it's controversial to say that this film's darker subject matter that it covers is maybe a bit more intense than your average cartoon, but that's not to say that this is better or worse as a movie than The Little Mermaid or The Toy Story. It's just designed to be a different type of movie. And I think The Land for Time is exactly what it set out to be. And for that reason, I think it still holds up. I started this video off teasing an epic showdown between Land for Time and Disney's Oliver and Company, a story of the Great House Mouse facing off against a man who once occupied their very own payroll. Two movies released the same year and, in fact, the exact same day. So, who won? Okay, so here's where things get a little complicated. I am nothing if not pro worker. I love rooting for the underdog, but I fear this just isn't that type of story, at least not completely. Out of the gate, things were looking promising for Lamp for Time, managing to earn just over 7.5 million its opening weekend. For context, their competition ranked in just under $4 million. As the weeks ticked on, however, Oliver and Company managed to gain some ground. If you look it up today, the global box office for Disney's movie sits at 121 million on a budget of just 31 million. Meanwhile, The Lamp for Time taps out at about 84.5 million and it had a budget of 12.3 million. So, case closed? Well, maybe not. When I was finishing my script, I learned that Oliver and Company did not, in fact, earn 121 million during its November 18th, 1988 release, but rather it capped at roughly 100 million. So, where did that extra $21 million come from? Well, apparently, this movie got a re release in March of 1996 where it earned, if you can believe it, $21 million. Funny enough, the second time it was released, it had actually been facing off against yet another Don Bluth film, this time being All Dogs Go to Heaven. So That's fun. So, anyways, if we're comparing apples to apples and just looking at the money of both the 1988 releases, 100 million is still more than 84.5 million. So now we have a winner, right? Well, and I'm not sure how fair this is, but I saw someone comparing the profits each movie made, and I thought that would be funny, so I wanted to share that. So, a disclosure, I don't believe the budget for each movie included dollars spent in advertising. I'm not even sure if those numbers are ever made public, but I certainly can find the totals for either film, which, if I'm being honest, I would assume would be a knock against Disney anyways, since they had much more pocket change that they could afford more advertising than Bluth anyways. But if you take the $100 million that Oliver and Company made and subtract the cost of producing such a movie, 31 million, you're left with $69 million. If you do the same math for Line for Time, you get 72 million, which, and this is true, is more. I'm not sure how I feel about doing math that way. It feels like if you need to do that much work and squint really hard, then maybe you're overthinking it. Like, I doubt any rando who looks up the box office is going to be digging that deep into it. So, does it really matter? I fully have no idea, but this was a close race, no matter how you slice it. But for the sake of being thorough, let's keep going. If we take money out of the equation instead and focus on both critic and audience reviews, we see that Line for Time usually comes out on top. Rotten Tomatoes has the audience score for Line for Time at 79% and critic score at 65% compared to Oliver and Company's 62% and 53% respectively. Hopping over to IMDb, The Line for Time rolls in at 7.4 out of 10, while their competitor is at 6.6 out of 10. And Google Reviews has our little dinos leading 4.8 to 4.6. There's enough here to lead credence to either company walking away feeling victorious. In fact, while doing research, I found articles on both sides of that exact same argument. But if you ask me, and you should, I would give the win here to Lamp for Time. It's a classic, and what's more impressive is that it managed to be so beloved without Disney's deep pockets backing it. The fact that a small team of animators were able to leave and someday challenge their massive former employer in and of itself is nothing short of incredible. And the fact that Disney needed to re-release Oliver and Company in order to create a greater contrast in their box office tells me that the contest was too close for them to even feel comfortable with. So, how'd I do? I've watched so many video essays over the years, and I've been pretty anxious about making this one. I have recorded and re-recorded and then re-recorded audio for this over the past couple months, and I finished the script like a year ago at this point, and I would just really love to hear your guys' thoughts, disagreements, or opinions down in the comments. If you like this video, or honestly, even if you didn't, be sure to like and subscribe. You can also follow me over on Instagram over at Troy the Art Boy, and I have a Patreon as well, also at Troy the Art Boy. And yeah, let me know what you guys think. I'm so curious, and if you guys like this, I would like to do more in the future. I have a list of other movies I would love to talk about. But either way, thank you guys so much for watching, and you'll see me in the next one. Bye.